As the sun set on summer for Ireland in the 1845s, a storm was brewing that was far beyond the comprehension of the Irishmen. The autumn leaves that came brought a dark haze with them, bringing chaos that Ireland had not seen in over 100 years. That haze was the Great Famine. Following the massive destruction of the potato crop due to potato blight, the immigration of Irishmen to America multiplied nearly 10 times over. The massive influx of hundreds of thousands of immigrants heavily oversaturated the number of workers, which in turn led towards massive ethnic discrimination against the Irish and a strong nativist sentiment that impacted the Irish workforce. At the time, most employers rejected these Irishmen, believing that they were lesser humans that were less competent than natural-born Americans. Some even went as far as to include the No Irish Need Apply clause after help wanted sign, indicating that they would not accept Irish workers at all. This direct statement of ethnic discrimination showed the impact of the mass exodus from Ireland to America on the nativist sentiment in the United States. If these Irishmen were to obtain jobs, they were often humdrum and dangerous tasks that would result in loss of limb or life at some point on the job. Furthermore, there was no way to protect themselves from this exploitation, as labor unions were heavily repressed at the time. Due to this harsh and unjust treatment, social mobility for Irishmen was extremely limited, and they had little hope of social advancement. This led to heavy resentment among the Irishmen, which would eventually turn into violent outbreaks during the Civil War, such as the draft riots.
Such rapid urbanization of areas led to intensified spreading of inadequate infrastructure, street and urban brawls, contamination, and more in the antebellum period. As many famous rising cities, like New York that are once better and healthier, became chaotic remains of disarray, Native Americans faulted the entrance of Irishmen. The Irishmen were already at the bottom levels of society, in taking charge of menial jobs, and such discrimination and hate from the upper middle class whites created deeper, more sensitive class tensions. The blacks acted as a barrier for the Irish in avoiding complete discrimination and disparagement as the very shameful bottom basement of society. Thus, although they were subject to heavy demands from low-status jobs and dealt with hostile harshness from the upper and middle classes, the idea that there existed another group lower and worse besides the Irish themselves provided relief to the victimized Irishmen. It is also important to note that the Irish were not the only ones harmed. Other immigrants, like the German 48ers, were discriminated, in which the Germans also used the class position of black slaves to find relief from the harm they received from upper and middle class whites. Anyhow, all immigrants were faced to confront heavy damage from the rest of society and organizations like the Nativist Party.
As the sectional tensions began to mount between the North and the South, the Civil War erupted in 1861, beginning with the shooting at Fort Sumter. Claiming that the war was based on preserving the Union, Lincoln was primarily focused on reclaiming the southern seceding states back into the Union as quick as possible. But as the war raged on, a new moral motivation emerged, the issue of slavery. Although the Emancipation Proclamation aided in creating a powerful moral motivation for the North, in reality, when Lincoln announced his Emancipation Proclamation, many Northerners were very opposed to the proclamation. These people included the Irish, who were the main participants in the New York draft riots of 1863.
After the Irish potato famine of 1848, Irish immigrants came into the U.S. Many Irish did menial labor, and they believed that occupational and social competition would result from newly freed slave populations, as many jobs for this menial labor would become scarce, and the entire social hierarchy of the United States society would be shifted. By the middle of the war, the zealous volunteers for the Union Army had become scarce, and the poorer population was drafted for the military, while the wealthy could escape conscription with a fee of $300, coining the term $300 man. John D. Rockefeller, a great oil monopolist, was able to easily utilize these conditions of the Enrollment Act of 1863 to escape the draft, along with George Templeton Strong, a New York lawyer, who said, "A big Dutch boy of about 20 was who I paid $1,100 to serve as his alter ego on the battlefield." The exercised wealth of these men to escape the draft reminded the Irish of the socio-economic stratification developed from the industrial economy of the North. Riots broke out across the country, especially in New York, where sympathizers to blacks, such as Abby Harper Gibbons, had their home destroyed or received bodily harm.
Building on the fact that the Irish raided blacks' homes, many amalgamationists, who were white women married to black men, found their homes raided and burned down because they were related to blacks who were being discriminated against. These amalgamationists included Ann Derrickson and Ann Martin, whose houses got raided and burned down. Unfortunately, amalgamationists weren't the only ones who were attacked by the discontented Irish. The Colored Orphan Asylum, which was a home for colored orphan children that housed over 200 children at the time, was also burned to the ground by the Irish. This burning down of black properties, even including the homes of black orphan children, reveals the intense racism that existed in the North, but also represents the class tensions that resulted from the Emancipation Proclamation, as the Irish now saw the black population as a source of competition that took jobs and other opportunities away from them. Many cases resulted in deaths of blacks as well, including Charles Jackson and William Jones, who were both blacks that were lynched by the Irish draft rioters.
The acts committed by the Irish during the week of July 13, 1863, seemed to be acts of blind rage, but after looking closer at the socioeconomic background and the hardships faced by these people, it quickly becomes evident that the real cause of these riots was the fear that was felt by these oppressed peoples. They had left their home country to find a better life in the United States, but were instead met by large groups of people who despised them simply because of where they had come from. Their slim foothold in society was found in the menial jobs that they were working at the time the Civil War broke out. Many of them were worried that if the blacks were freed, the northern job market would become flooded, and their slim standing in society would be lost, leaving them with nothing. One of the areas that the Irish and other immigrants had originally dominated in was the longshoreman profession. Longshoremen were people who worked on docks and helped to load and unload cargo from ships that were coming in and out of the harbor. However, as more and more free blacks began to trickle into the northern cities, the Irish saw their monopoly on this menial business slipping away, with free blacks filling the areas they had once dominated. Thus, when the riots broke out, one of the groups that were targeted the most were the blacks that had found jobs as longshoremen. The Longshoremen's Association, which was a white labor union, was patrolling the piers during the riots and insisted that the colored people must and shall be driven to other parts of the industry. However, this sentiment was echoed by every other part of the industry where Irishmen worked. Despite what the riots originally seemed like on the surface, the true resentment of the Irish was not directed entirely towards the blacks. It was also directed towards rich businessmen such as George Templeton Strong and John D. Rockefeller, as well as the nativist Americans who despised immigrants and worked to keep them on the outskirts of society. Unfortunately, when the Irish finally snapped, they focused their rage on the only group they could, the black population. This riot was not simply an act of blind rage. It was a scared and disenfranchised group taking a violent stand to protect the small foothold they had in society. Unfortunately, the way in which they tried to stand up was very flawed and ended in massive loss of life.